Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Romeo and Juliet. This video is going to focus on Act 3, Scene 3, conversations between the friar, between Romeo and the nurse. Let's get started.
Quick plot summary for you to start us off. So the scene begins in Friar Lawrence's cell with Romeo hiding out with him, and they're obviously having a conversation about what's to happen. Romeo is asking the friar what the prince has said and what is going to happen to him. And it is the friar that tells him that he has been banished and he is obviously going to have to go and leave Verona and live elsewhere, because if he comes back to the city, then obviously he will be executed. Now, Romeo has a huge reaction to this, rather than recognizing that actually perhaps he's been dealt with a little more fairly because he's not being put to death, i.e. he gets to live. He sees banishment as a punishment worse than death, and actually cries that it should have been death. And he says death would have been a mercy in this situation. It's a scene that really demonstrates Romeo's kind of impulsive, rash responses. Another moment where Romeo comes across as being quite young, quite immature, certainly in massive juxtaposition to the friar, but also in contrast to Juliet from the previous scene, who, although was very emotional, quite rightly, she wasn't a lunatic about the whole thing. And speaking of Juliet, the nurse arrives, knocks on the door to bring, Juliet's ring to Romeo and kind of find out. And the nurse and the friar have a conversation about the two young lovers and their kind of massive responses and reactions to this. Ultimately, the nurse gives Romeo Juliet's ring, which gives him great comfort. And we get this, again, massive juxtaposition between his kind of chaotic grief at the beginning and then his feeling of relief at the end when he realizes that Juliet still loves him. And the friar tells him that, he's going to have this one opportunity to go and be with Juliet and comfort her, and then he will have to disappear off to Mantua. But the idea is, what the friar is planning on doing is saying, right, you go off to Mantua, which is accepted and allowed and totally normal because he's been banished. And he's like, and I'll sort it out. Like, I'll get the prince to listen. Obviously he's already married to Juliet. And the friar essentially just needs to explain that, and all should be well. But of course it's a tragedy, so of course it will not be well. Okay, let's look at the opening of the scene. So Friar Lawrence says, Romeo, come forth, thou fearful man. So reminded that he's been hiding and he's now sort of coming out into the open to Friar. Affliction is enamoured of thy parts, and thou art wedded to calamity. Excellent metaphor that describes that contrast and that both the contrast and togetherness of love and conflict. He says affliction, pain or suffering, is enamoured of thy parts. Okay, so there's pain loves him basically, and he is wedded to calamity. So the idea calamity is again disaster. So Romeo is wedded to disaster. That's fair. Romeo says, Father, what news? What is the prince's doom? What sorrow craves acquaintance at my hand that I yet know not? Okay, so it shows us that Romeo is in the dark about the prince's judgment, as you can tell from these repeated interrogatives or question. But note the drama in this moment as well, the emotive language, the use of the abstract noun doom, suggesting this kind of ominous future. He feels doomed. What sorrow craves acquaintance? We've got this personification here, at my hand that I yet know not. So this is a little bit of a euphemism for punishment here, as in what is going to happen to me. So you get this kind of real sense of doubt in this moment. And here is some massive reactions. So the friar, after telling Romeo that he has been banished rather than being sentenced to death, which we should all be going, yay, that's the best thing that could have happened, considering what the prince had vowed in Act 1, Scene 1. But Romeo instead responds in huge metaphorical terms. There is no world without Verona walls, but purgatory, torture, hell itself. So note this triad here that we've got, purgatory, torture, hell. Note the way that it amplifies from purgatory, the kind of waiting ground, to the suffering, to hell itself. Yeah, so if he's not in Verona, he's in hell. So hence banished is banished from the world, and world exile is death. So note the hyperbole here, how unbelievably over the top this is, because he's basically saying, by removing me from Verona, I am death. Then banished is death mistermed, calling death banishment. Thou cuttest my head off with a golden axe, and smilest upon the stroke that murders me. So he's saying, you may as well kill me anyway. We've got this wonderful juxtaposition between smiling and murdering, the fact that the axe is golden. He's basically saying, yeah, you're just making the death seem nicer, but that's all it really is. But this response, like I said, it's so enormous and negative for a person whose life has just been spared. Hence the friar's frustration. O deadly sin, O rude unthankfulness. So obviously he's speaking in exclamatives because he's just so irritated. Thy fault our law calls death, but the kind prince, taking thy part, hath rushed aside the law and turned that black word death to banishment. So the friar is being logical and totally reasonable. It is another one of these kind of paternal moments where, you know, the friar is the father figure, certainly the teacher. And he's reminding Romeo that actually the prince has kind of taken his side. He's like, what you did should result in your death. And the prince has instead changed death to banishment. It's mercy. You know, he has treated you well. But of course, yeah, Romeo doesn't quite see it this way at the moment. We get the wonderful interruption of our lovely nurse, who comes to find Romeo on Juliet's behalf. And I think this is a really lovely moment where, again, this idea, this theme of age versus youth, this sort of wisdom versus impulsiveness is demonstrated here. So where she asks where Romeo is, we've got this wonderful metaphor, there on the ground with his own tears made drunk. You know, Romeo is like lying on the floor crying. We've got this wonderful hyperbole here, his own tears have made drunk. So he's literally just like, whoa, flooded in his own tears. And the nurse says, in response to this hyperbole, like, yeah, just like Juliet. Oh, he is, even in my mistress's case, just in her case. So she's exactly the same. A woeful sympathy, piteous predicament, even so lies she, blubbering and weeping, weeping and blubbering. So you've got this lovely repetition. If you wanted the fancy term, you can call it anadiplosis, which is where you repeat the word at the end of a clause at the beginning. It's also a panalepsis as well, because you've got it the beginning and then again at the end. Repetition will do. But again, we're being reminded of Juliet's youth here, particularly the verb blubbering. It's not particularly elegant to cry, so it suggests her like massively heightened emotion, but it's again quite childish. But I do think we can make a sort of slight difference or mark a difference between Romeo and Juliet, because Juliet is weeping for more than one thing. Juliet's cousin has been killed by her husband. Yeah, that's worth a cry. Romeo, yes, of course, can be upset that he's done this and he's made his life difficult, but actually his life has been spared. So Juliet's kind of tears, I think you can really kind of understand, whereas Romeo, I think you might just want to shake him a little bit. Which is sort of how the nurse responds here. Stand up, stand and you be a man. For Juliet's sake, for her sake, rise and stand. Yeah, so loads of imperatives. She's telling them off. Get to your feet, she says. Why should you fall into so deep an O? So there's a bit of judgment there. Like, Juliet's got something to cry about. What have you got to cry about? You're the one that did it, and you've been spared. So very, very kind of straight talking from the nurse here. I find this scene, this moment, quite difficult, and it's echoed, in Juliet's lines before. There is this quite alarming sort of suicidal impulse in both of these young lovers. Romeo says when he hears of Juliet's grief on him because of Romeo, he says, as if that name, shot from the deadly level of a gun, did murder her. So this analogy of his name being like the bullet of a gun, obviously personifying murdered her. So his name, his essence, who he is, the fact that he is Romeo, has murdered her. It's his name that's done it. As that name's cursed hand murdered her kinsman. Note the metaphor, the idea of the hand being cursed ties into the idea of fate, that it's all moving towards something that he can't control. Oh, tell me, friar, tell me, in what vile part of this anatomy does my name lodge? Now, vile part of his anatomy, he's talking about his body. So he's like, where does my name live in my body that I may sack the hateful mansion? This is obviously a metaphor for death. He's talking about killing himself. So obviously we've got foreshadowing here. He's like, where does my name exist in my body? Because I'll kill that. Yeah. So we've got this really interesting inversion of language here, because it was only earlier in Act 2 that we heard Juliet talking about what a name, Act 2, Scene 2, what relevance a name has. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. She asks Romeo to tear up his name when she says she will tear up her name. And in these moments, Romeo is saying, I want to kill my name because my name is a representation of who has killed Tybalt and therefore what is killing Juliet. And we also have this image of the mansion again, just in the very early scene where we have Juliet sat at home waiting for Romeo. She talks about the mansion being bought but not possessed. And so again, we've got this parallel that we see often between Romeo and Juliet, their language mirroring each other. But in this case, it's an inversion, because it's all of the ideas about expectation and excitement before have now changed to death. I've labelled this Childish Romeo. I could label the whole thing Childish Romeo. I do quite like this bit, because this is the friar very much telling Romeo off. He says, what roused thee, man? So, get up. Thy Juliet is alive, for whose dear sake thou wast but lately dead. There art thou happy. Tybalt would kill thee, but thou slewest Tybalt. There art thou happy too. The law that threatened death becomes thy friend and turns it to exile. There art thou happy. So note the way that we've got these juxtapositions between expectation and reality, with the repetition of there art thou happy, that declarative sentence. Again, it's teaching Romeo, just like, come on, look at this. You should be happy. You're expecting it to be like this, but it turned out this way. You should be happy. Then we've got this personification. The law that threatened death becomes thy friend. Okay, so personified law, again referring to the prince being merciful. A pack of blessings lights up upon thy back. Happiness courts thee in her best array. So we've got this metaphor, again, personification as well, really, about happiness being conjoined with Romeo, just throwing light upon him. So the friar is like listing all of the ways that Romeo actually has been treated pretty damn well. And instead, but like a misbehaved and sullen wench, thou poutest upon thy fortune and thy love. Take heed, for such die miserable. So we've got the juxtaposition from the happiness that he should have with his actual behaviour. Nice little simile here, misbehaved and sullen. You're pouting on your fortune and your love. So you're sulking when you should be happy. But here's the foreshadowing. Take heed, for such die miserable. Which is, of course, exactly what does happen. Scene ends positively. Romeo is relieved. Romeo is thankful because the nurse has given Romeo Juliet's token of the rings, and so the scene ends with a positive note, thankfully, because we need a little bit of positivity after all that drama. But what is this scene important for? Well, we've got this idea about fate, the notion of him being doomed. This, even in this moment where we have a kind of happy ending to the scene, we know what's going to happen. We know that they are moving towards this joint death of suicide, which makes the all of the suicidal imagery in here so poignant and such a marker of fate. It is, of course, about love. Romeo and Juliet's love for each other despite the circumstances, death and conflict, not just in terms of the conflict that has just happened, but again this sort of suicidal impulse, this desire to die, the idea that death is better than banishment in some way, and of course the consequences. So we've got the notion of the consequences of Romeo's actions, but all of this is moving towards that ultimate consequence, again reminding us of their tragic fate. That's it from me. Thank you very much for watching. Any questions or queries, just drop me a little comment and I will get back to you. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. You know what to do. Just click that button. And then you will be alerted when all of the new videos are coming out. Do check out my playlists for any other videos that you may find helpful with your English language or literature. That's it from me. Happy revising.